And it also will probably affect students are going to start to have to think about their college lists based upon what the scores they're looking at or what they hope their scores might be. So the real question is, in developing a college list, we all know that with the pandemic, I think the number of schools, maybe even that students are applying to, has really blown up. I mean, as far as applying to almost probably more schools than students need to. So it kind of begs the question, like, how many reach schools, match schools, likely schools should a student try to have on their college, like their list of colleges?
Right. And that's such a great question. And obviously it's nuanced and it really, depends on the student. I think the tricky part is for students who do have those higher test scores, but who also understand the lay of the land and the dropping admit rates. They're more likely to apply to more of these really hard to get into reach schools. But that's also tricky because those schools usually have a lot more essay prompts, right? So there's all the supplemental essays. So I typically see students, who end up sort of, when they build their college list with me, they have, 7 or 8 reach schools, maybe a couple of match schools, maybe a couple of safeties. I would love to see that shift a little bit. I would love to see students really dig deeper into why they're applying. Don't just apply to all 8 Ivies because they're very different from each other. I understand the reasoning though, because admissions, can seem like a crapshoot. I understand, that applying to a lot of reach schools seems to be the only way to do it. But I really would like to see a little more balance between reach, match, and safety.
And one question I would have about reach is really, are we seeing, or did you see with any of your students in the last year or so, are you seeing these stories of the kid who didn't submit scores magically get admitted? I'm curious because I'm not seeing that in where I'm from. I'm curious if you're seeing that for the students who applied to reach and didn't submit a score. Did you see any difference in terms of kids like magically getting that reach school?
Right. Now, that's a great question. I would say this last application cycle, more of my students submitted test scores. There were exceptions in certain categories, which we probably won't have time to get into today, but there are certain categories of students, say athletes or whatever, or legacy or, whatever, who I saw get into really selective colleges without test scores. Having said that, I also saw some barriers to students who opted not to do testing, particularly homeschool students. I had one homeschool student who, met barrier after barrier. The student was top rate and ended up at a great University of California school. But I absolutely saw a barrier to not having test scores. So, by and large, I think the kids with test scores this past cycle did a little bit better overall, but there were some exceptions that I saw.
And do you think with better test scores, those reach schools even seem a little better? Do you feel like, I mean, if you have a test score?
Yes, particularly for those students who might not have anything that you and I would call a hook. So yeah, I think, having really strong test scores for those colleges. I mean, look, this year, the big debate out there is, test optional or not. MIT reinstated a testing requirement. Caltech has just said they're going test blind for 2 more years. So this is an example of 2, very selective STEM schools who have come down on different sides of the equation. So students need to know, their school's policies well and test accordingly.
And that's exactly right. It's about education. And unfortunately, even if you had a student apply a year ago or 2 years ago, you have to do your homework again to make sure you're up to date with whatever those policies are. It does beg the question, though, in terms of a match. What do you think a match actually is, or a likely school actually is, if we're talking about a student who's in the class of 2023?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because I will get students and parents shocked when I tell them, no, that is a reach school. And they'll say, well, what are you talking about? Say Northeastern is a great example. 5-6 years ago, their admit rate sat around 30%. this past admission cycle, their regular decision admit rate was 5%.
That's
So,
like Stanford level admit
that's
rate.
Stanford level, right? So I'm very conservative when it comes to, what I call a reach, match, and safety. And honestly, I call a match where your stats, that is your GPA, if you can find it, sometimes it's opaque and it's difficult to find, but you have a really good, strong GPA, your test scores are in above the 50th percentile, and that school admits between 40 and 60%. I call that actually a match. And most people are like shocked. What? I call that a match because I've seen
That needs to be at this point, right? Like
Yes.
nothing seems like a safety anymore.
Right. So
You have to have a really good chance of getting in.
Exactly, Mike. So I do safety, like 60% or above. You are clearly in the 75th percentile. And quite frankly, you are showing strong interest in that school, because I've had a lot of, people, I've seen a lot of people just shocked. What? I didn't get into the schools that admit, 30, 35%, we had to go out to the 40%. And the answer is yes, particularly those schools that, really want you to show interest in them.
What about safety schools? I mean, so in the past, a safety school was a set it and forget it. You didn't have to acknowledge them at all. They were going to be there for you if everything else fell through. Do students need to actually demonstrate interest in their safety schools these days?
I would say in some safety schools, right? So if we're pushing, outward of 50, 60%, and a student comes in with just, screaming high, AP scores, SAT score, GPA activities, I think that student does have to let the school know in some way that they are very interested in that school. I mean, to be honest, I had a student this year who got into some of, schools that admit about, 4%, 5%. And the student was waitlisted at schools like UC Riverside.
Right.
So it's super interesting. So yeah, the answer, Mike, is probably you really need to, even for your safeties, let them know that they really are a school that you want to attend.
Because families should understand part of this is about yield, right? If the school doesn't think you're legitimately going to come, they don't want to risk giving you an acceptance that they know you're potentially going to pass on. So there's a lot of
there's a lot of nuances. Right.
Right.
And we all know, the three of us and other people will know, college is a business, and yield is the thing. Who's going to come? Will we fill out our class? That's so important.
Are there places parents or students can go to really better understand like this data? Like, is there any place you recommend like to find like where you fit in your data? Is there an easy answer to that?
Boy, that's a great question. I think there are a couple of places that Common Data Set.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Yeah. The Common Data Set has a lot of this. College Board, Big Future used to have it, but they pulled off way too much data. But yeah, so each college, if you Google,
and there are also places like Navient or
Score,
right. You're talking about those data clearinghouses, but at the same time, what do financial advisors say? Past performance is not indicative of future results.
Exactly.
And we're talking about what's evolving in terms of admissions trends.
And the cautionary note really isn't it that a lot of these places that we used to rely on, like a Naviance with the scattergrams that are very useful, they contain data that is not reflective of whether those students submitted test scores or not. So the hard part is the places we used to referred students for that data. That's kind of what I'm getting at is like,
oh yeah. So, right. So me personally, I love College Kickstart. College Kickstart, they've done an analysis. The data is still coming in slowly. So I think that's the biggest challenge. The data is coming in, like the University of California doesn't release their data until like September. But College Kickstart is where, I wrote an article after attending, a webinar with College Kickstart, and they teased out the data of students who submitted test scores versus those who didn't. So I really like them. They're doing the hard work. There's also a blog, CTAS, that I would recommend for people as well.
Okay, perfect. And I think that asterisked answer to your question, Amy, is that
Yes.
it's usually important for people to consult professionals who know how to read the data and make sense of it, which is what we're trying to do. We hope you enjoyed this video as much as we did. You'll find plenty more like it when you explore the Tests and the Rest channel. Be sure to comment, share, and subscribe for a constant stream of insights into learning, education, testing, and admissions. For full podcasts and amazing resources, find us at testsandtherest.com.